My brother called me from a blocked number at 3 a.m. and said 4 words: "Don't eat the food." That was it. No context, no explanation, no follow-up text. Just 4 words delivered in a voice I barely recognized, hushed and tight, like he was hiding somewhere and couldn't afford to be heard. And then silence. Dead air where my brother used to be. I was standing in my uncle's kitchen when it happened. I had one hand wrapped around a bowl of chili and the other holding my phone. And I remember looking at the steam still rising off the surface of the food and thinking about how normal everything had felt 30 seconds ago. The refrigerator humming in the corner, the television going low in the next room, the smell of cumin and slow-cooked beef filling up the whole downstairs the way it always did when my uncle made his recipe on weeknights. It was the kind of smell that made you feel like you were somewhere safe. It was the kind of smell I had grown to associate with being taken care of. I set the bowl on the counter. I don't know why I did it so fast. I hadn't processed anything yet. My brother had only said 4 words, and those 4 words were vague enough that a reasonable person could have dismissed them as a prank, a wrong number, a weird moment that meant nothing. But something about his voice had hit some part of my brain that doesn't bother with reason, some animal part that just reacts. And the reaction was to put down the food. That was the beginning of the worst 6 months of my life, and also somehow the thing that probably saved it. I want to go back and explain how I ended up standing in that kitchen, in that house, eating that chili, because none of it was random. There was a road that led me there, and I didn't see any of the signs along the way, and I think that's the part that haunts me the most when I lay awake at night now. Not what my uncle did, not even what he almost did to me, but the fact that I walked straight into it with my eyes open and a duffel bag over my shoulder, genuinely grateful for the opportunity. I had a job I loved and lost it in March of that year. I was a coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of job that isn't glamorous but pays reliably and gives you just enough structure to build a life around. I had a 1-bedroom apartment 30 minutes from work. I had a routine. I had health insurance and a savings account and a mental picture of what the next 5 years were supposed to look like. And then a private equity group bought the company, spent 4 months auditing everything, and eliminated my entire department in a single email sent on a Friday afternoon at 4:52 p.m. I found out the same time everyone else did. There was no warning, no transition package beyond what was legally required, and no acknowledgement of the 7 years I had spent building something I cared about. The email was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked us for our contributions. The second explained the restructuring. The third contained HR contact information. I drove home that Friday and sat in my parking lot for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The first month wasn't so bad. I had savings. I filed for unemployment. I sent out applications and told myself the market was rough, but I had experience and it would work out. The second month was harder. The applications were going out and nothing was coming back. Or what came back was rejection. Or what came back was silence. The third month I started doing the math in a way I had been avoiding. Rent plus utilities plus food plus the minimum on my credit card, set against what was left in my account. The number I arrived at was not a comfortable one. By April, I had 2 months of rent I couldn't cover, and a landlord who had started responding to my messages with decreasing warmth. My savings were nearly gone. My brother was living across the state with a roommate situation that had no room for me. My parents had both passed. My father when I was 19, my mother 3 years later, and the only family I had left in any practical sense was my uncle, my mother's brother, the one who had always shown up at holidays with a bottle of wine and a loud laugh and opinions about everything. He was in his late 60s by then, retired from a career in commercial real estate and living alone in the house where he and my mother had grown up. My grandmother had lived there too until she passed the previous year. He'd taken the house after she died. That was the understanding. He had cared for her in her final years, so the house went to him. That was the family logic, and nobody had questioned it. He called me on a Wednesday evening in April, which was strange because my uncle didn't usually call. He texted. He emailed occasionally. Phone calls were for emergencies or announcements. I almost didn't pick up. He said he'd heard things were difficult. He said he had more space than he needed. He said my mother would have wanted him to help, and my grandmother would have said the same thing, and family was supposed to take care of each other when things got hard. He said I could have the spare room for as long as I needed, no rent, just help around the house when I had time, and that I should think about it and let him know. I thought about it for approximately 1 day before calling him back and saying yes. I packed 2 bags and a box of books and drove 4 hours to his house on a Sunday morning in early May. He had coffee ready when I got there. He'd made a fresh batch of the chili that would become a regular fixture of my life in that house. The same recipe his mother had taught him, he said, the same one he'd been making since he was a teenager. He showed me the spare room, which was clean and bright and had a window facing the backyard. He showed me where the extra key hung by the back door. He said to make myself at home. I made myself at home. The first few weeks were strange in the way that all new living situations are strange. Getting used to someone else's rhythms, their schedule, the particular way they occupied space. My uncle woke up early and was usually in the kitchen by 6. He read the newspaper, the actual print edition, folded in a specific way. He made coffee in a specific order and had opinions about the water temperature. He liked the television on at a low volume in the evenings, news programming mostly, and he preferred dinner at 7 o'clock. He cooked almost every night. That was the thing I noticed early and kept noticing. It wasn't occasional or out of obligation. It was clearly something he took genuine genuine pleasure in. He had a full spice cabinet organized alphabetically and an actual handwritten recipe book, and he knew things about technique that made it obvious he'd been doing this seriously for decades. We ate well in that house, better than I'd eaten in years, honestly. Real food, not the shortcuts I'd defaulted to when I was living on my own and working long hours. I told myself repeatedly how lucky I was. I told my brother this when we talked on the phone. I told a friend who checked in from time to time that my uncle was genuinely kind and that the arrangement was working out better than I'd expected. I wasn't performing gratitude. I felt it. The house was comfortable and my uncle was warm, and the pressure of the financial spiral I'd been in for months had lifted enough that I could breathe again. I found part-time work at a local warehouse within my first month there. Not what I wanted long-term, but enough to put some money back in savings and give my days structure. I applied to jobs in the evenings after dinner. My uncle would bring me a cup of coffee at the kitchen table sometimes while I worked without being asked. He never made me feel like a burden. He never made me feel like the clock was running. The first thing I noticed that was wrong, the very first thing, though I didn't recognize it as wrong at the time, was a headache. It started about 3 weeks in. Not severe, just persistent. The kind that sits at the base of your skull and makes you slightly aware of your head in a way you normally aren't. I blamed my sleep, which had been inconsistent since losing my job. I blamed screen time. I blamed the change in altitude, though the town wasn't notably higher than where I'd been living. I took ibuprofen and went to bed early and woke up the next day feeling roughly the same. The headaches became regular. Not every day, but often enough that I started noticing the pattern. They were worse in the mornings. They usually faded by afternoon. My concentration wasn't quite right either. I'd be reading through a job application and realize I'd reread the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. I put that down to stress. I put almost everything down to stress in those months, because stress was the obvious variable, the thing that had changed, the easy explanation for anything that felt off. I mentioned the headaches to my uncle once in passing. He said he'd noticed I looked tired. He brought me a glass of water and suggested I might be dehydrated. He was concerned and practical and completely normal about it. I drank the water and went back to what I was doing. I didn't think about that conversation again until much later, when I was thinking about a lot of things I had missed. My brother and I talked every week or two, sometimes more. We weren't close in the way siblings are in the movies. We didn't confide everything. We didn't call each other every day, but we had the kind of low-maintenance connection that most adult siblings settle into, where you know someone is there even when you're not actively in contact. He was 3 years older than me and had always been more methodical, more careful. He worked in financial auditing, which fit him perfectly. He was the kind of person who noticed when numbers didn't add up and felt physically uncomfortable leaving the discrepancy unexamined. He'd been suspicious of our uncle since before I moved in. He hadn't said anything to me directly. He told me later that he didn't want to alarm me without proof, and that he knew I was in a fragile situation and needed the stability, but he'd been paying attention in a way I hadn't. It started with my grandmother. Our grandmother had been the kind of person who seemed like she was going to live forever. Not because she was exceptionally healthy, though she was. She gardened well into her late 70s and walked every morning and had the kind of constitution that seemed to resist time, but because she was so fundamentally present. She was alert and sharp and interested in everything. She remembered names and dates and the specific details of conversations that had happened years ago. She did crossword puzzles every morning without cheating. She read novels. She had opinions. She was, until she wasn't, the clearest-minded person I knew. The decline started about 18 months before she died. Looking back, we could all identify the approximate moment it began, though none of us had flagged it as anything more than the beginning of old age. She started forgetting things, small things at first, keys and appointments, the kind of forgetting that most people do. Then larger things. She got confused about days of the week. She struggled to follow conversations that moved quickly. She started having stomach problems that her doctor attributed to changes in her digestive system. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. The doctors called it age-related cognitive decline. They adjusted her medications. They recommended she not live alone. Our uncle, who was already nearby and who had always been close to her, stepped up. He moved into the house to care for her. He managed her medications and her appointments and her daily routine. The family was grateful. He was doing something difficult and doing it with what appeared to be love and patience, and everyone said so. She died 14 months after the decline began, quietly, at home, in her sleep. The official cause of death was organ failure consistent with her age and deteriorating health. My brother went to the funeral and came back with a feeling he couldn't name. He described it to me later as a kind of wrongness he couldn't pin down. Something about the way our uncle moved through the service, something about a comment he made to a neighbor that struck my brother as oddly specific about the legal process of transferring assets after a death. He said he tried to dismiss it. He said he told himself he was grieving and projecting. He didn't dismiss it for long. It started, he told me later, with the medical bills. He'd been helping settle my grandmother's estate, one of those administrative tasks that falls to whoever is most organized, and in our family that was always my brother, and he started noticing things that didn't line up. Prescriptions she'd been filling that her primary doctor had no record of ordering, supplements purchased in quantities that seemed excessive, a pattern in her pharmacy records where certain items appeared regularly and then disappeared, and where the timing of those appearances corresponded roughly to periods when her confusion had been notably worse. worse. He spent 2 months before he told anyone anything. He pulled every record he could access legally. He tracked down the visiting nurse who had come to the house twice a week during my grandmother's last year. A woman who had retired and moved to another state, but who still remembered my grandmother clearly, who had liked her, and who had her own questions she'd never known who to give to. The nurse told my brother that she had noticed things, that my grandmother seemed worse on some days than others in ways that didn't track with what she'd been told about the progression of her decline, that on certain days she was barely functional, and on others she was almost herself, that the pattern felt less like disease and more like something else she hadn't been able to name. My brother contacted a toxicologist through a professional connection, someone whose name he'd encountered in an auditing case involving contaminated products. He described what he'd found without revealing the family context. The toxicologist told him that the pattern he was describing was consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning using compounds that were difficult to detect in standard medical screenings, that produced symptoms mimicking cognitive decline in elderly patients, and that required sustained administration over time to achieve the effect he was describing. He sat with that information for a week before he called me. He didn't tell me everything. He told me enough that he had concerns about our uncle, that he was looking into something that he needed more time to verify, that I should be careful without alarming my uncle or doing anything that might alert him that something was being investigated. He said he would tell me more as soon as he could. I didn't sleep well that week. I didn't know exactly what I was afraid of because my brother hadn't told me exactly what he suspected, but I knew him well enough to know that when he said he had concerns, he meant he was fairly certain something was wrong. My brother didn't raise alarms speculatively. He raised them when the data was already pointing somewhere he couldn't ignore. The call came 3 weeks after that conversation. I had been careful in those 3 weeks in ways I couldn't have fully articulated. I wasn't not eating the food my uncle made. That would have been too obvious, too visible a change in my behavior. But I was more conscious of what I was eating and how much. I was paying attention to the headaches and the foggy mornings in a different way. I was watching my uncle in a different way, and I felt guilty about it because he had given me nothing concrete to justify suspicion, and he had been nothing but kind to me, and every time I looked at him across the dinner table, I felt like the worst kind of ungrateful person. That Tuesday night he made chili, the same recipe, the same process. I watched him make it, which I did sometimes, standing at the edge of the kitchen while he talked about whatever he was thinking about. He was in a good mood. He talked about a documentary he'd watched the night before, and about a neighbor's dog that had gotten into his garden, and about a memory he had of his mother making the same recipe when he was a boy. He was warm and funny and entirely himself. He served it at 7 o'clock. I sat at the table and ate about half the bowl. My phone buzzed at 7:23 p.m. Blocked number. I answered it thinking it was a spam call or a wrong number. It was my brother. He said, "Don't eat the food. Don't eat anything he makes." And then the line went dead. I sat at the table for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 30 seconds. My uncle was in the other room. I could hear the television. The bowl was in front of me with the spoon still in it. I looked at it the way you look at something when you're not sure yet what it means. And then I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen and set it on the counter and told myself I would figure out what to do with it. My uncle came in from the living room 2 minutes later. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, easy and unhurried, wiping down the counter near the stove, and then he saw the bowl. He looked at it, then he looked at me. Not hungry? It was a perfectly normal thing to say. It was the thing anyone would say if they'd cooked dinner, and the person they'd cooked it for had left it half-eaten on the counter. But something in the way he looked at that bowl before he looked at my face, the sequence of it, the fraction of a second in which the bowl got his attention before I did, lodged somewhere in the back of my mind and would not move. I told him I wasn't feeling well. I said I thought I might be coming down with something. The headache I'd had all day had gotten worse. I was going to go to bed early and see if sleep helped. He said that was a good idea. He said he hoped I felt better. He did not push me to eat more. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I tried to call my brother back immediately. It went to voicemail. His regular outgoing message, calm and professional, completely at odds with what had just happened. I called 3 more times over the next 20 minutes. Same result. I had a second phone. I'd gotten it during my last job, a cheap prepaid thing for work calls I'd wanted to keep separate from my personal line, and I'd kept it out of habit without a clear reason. The way you keep things that don't cost much to maintain. Nobody in that house knew it existed. I hadn't mentioned it because there had been no reason to mention it. I texted my brother from it. I said, "I got your call. What's going on? I need to know right now." He responded 11 minutes later with a message that I read 4 times before I could absorb it. He had found something when he went deeper into my grandmother's medical records, deeper than the billing history, into the actual clinical notes from her last 14 months. He had obtained these through channels he didn't fully explain, but the toxicologist he'd consulted had connections in the medical examiner's network, and those connections had opened doors. What he found was that my grandmother's blood panels from her last year showed fluctuating levels of a compound that should not have been present in someone whose medication list matched what our uncle had reported to her doctors. The compound was not in anything she had been prescribed. It was, according to the toxicologist, consistent with a class of substances used historically in rodenticide and occasionally, in trace amounts, in some legitimate agricultural products, and also consistent in the dosages suggested by the blood panel fluctuations, with the deliberate slow poisoning of of an elderly person whose decline would be attributed to age. He had taken this to an attorney, a friend who specialized in estate litigation, who had reviewed everything he'd compiled and told him that the evidence was serious enough to bring to law enforcement. He had also taken it to the county detective's office the previous week, a detective who handled elder abuse cases, someone his attorney contact knew by name. The detective had opened a preliminary inquiry, but none of that had moved fast enough, because 2 days before, my brother had been contacted by the detective, who told him that the inquiry had expanded in a direction they hadn't anticipated, that in the process of reviewing the financial records connected to the estate, records that the detective had obtained through a court order, they had found evidence suggesting that the transfer of the house had been done under conditions that potentially constituted fraud, that my grandmother had signed documents while her cognitive capacity was materially compromised, and that they were now treating this as a criminal investigation, not just a civil matter. The detective had also told my brother something that had made him call me from a blocked number 30 seconds later. They had found purchase records that suggested my uncle had been acquiring certain compounds in consistent quantities for the past 8 months. The most recent purchase had been made 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks after I moved in, I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hands and let that land. I let myself do the math. 2 weeks after I moved in, he had made another purchase. The same compounds, the same pattern. I thought about the headaches that had started 3 weeks into my stay and never fully gone away. I thought about the foggy mornings. I thought about the bowl of chili on the kitchen counter downstairs with the spoon still resting in it. I thought about my grandmother, who had done crossword puzzles every morning and remembered the specific details of conversations that had happened years ago, who had become someone who couldn't recognize the people she loved, who had died quietly in the house where she was born while her son managed her medications and said all the right things at the funeral. I went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet to mask the sound and threw up. My brother's message ended with instructions. He said, "Do not tell him anything is wrong. Do not change your behavior in any obvious way tonight. Tomorrow morning, go to the police station and ask for the detective whose name he included." He said he had already given the detective my name. He said to bring my phone so I could show them his messages. He said, "Do not eat anything else in that house tonight." I went back to my room and lay on top of the covers with my clothes still on. I could hear my uncle downstairs, the familiar sounds of his evening routine, the television, the occasional movement through the kitchen, the sounds of the house settling into night, the sounds I had spent 4 months finding comforting. I lay there and ran through every meal I had eaten in that house. Every bowl of chili, every plate of roasted chicken, every pot of soup he had made and brought to the table while I sat across from him and felt grateful. I thought about the Saturday mornings when he made eggs and coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and he read the newspaper, and I applied for jobs, and it had felt like something close to peace. I thought about what peace costs when you don't know what you're paying for it. I didn't sleep. I lay there until the sounds downstairs stopped, and the light under my door went dark, and the house went quiet. I lay there for another hour after that to be certain, and then I got up, took my 2 bags from the closet, packed everything I owned as quietly as I could manage, and waited for 6 a.m. When the clock on my phone hit 5:58, I picked up my bags and walked out of that house. I did not leave a note. I did not take any food for the road. I drove straight to the police station and sat in the parking lot until the doors opened. The detective my brother had named was a woman in her early 50s with a particular kind of stillness about her, the quality that certain people develop after spending years in rooms where the stakes are very high and the emotions run very fast. She had short gray hair and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she looked at me when I came in the way someone looks when they were expecting you and have been thinking about what to say. She brought me to a conference room. She brought coffee without asking. She sat across from me and said, "Your brother told me a lot. I'd like to hear your side of it." I talked for nearly 2 hours. I told her everything. The timeline of moving in, the headaches, the foggy mornings, the phone call the previous night, the text messages, the bowl of chili on the counter, the way my uncle had looked at it before looking at me. I showed her everything on my phone. She took notes in a small spiral notebook with a pen she clicked before writing and clicked again when she paused to think. She asked questions that were precise and specific and told me nothing about where her thinking was going. At the end, she said, "I'm going to need you to do something that's going to be hard. I'm going to need you to get your blood drawn today. At the medical facility I'm going to give you the address of so that we can establish a baseline and document anything that might be there." She said it mattered for the investigation. She said it mattered for me personally. I drove to the medical facility she named. The technician there was expecting me. She had called ahead, and they drew 4 vials of blood and told me the results would go directly to the county medical examiner's office with a copy to me. Then I drove to my brother's city, 4 hours away, and slept on his couch for the first time in my adult life. While I was driving, the detective was moving. My brother told me later about what happened in the days that followed, piece by piece, as he learned it from his attorney contact and from the detective herself, who kept him informed because he was the one who had initiated the inquiry. I'm going to tell you what I learned, and I want to be clear that some of this came to me over weeks and months, not all at once, but I'm going to tell it straight through because the truth of it deserves to be told that way. The county medical examiner received an order to retest biological samples that had been retained from my grandmother's autopsy. This was not a routine request. Standard practice in most counties is to retain samples for a period following any death, but the order to retest required a showing that there was probable cause to believe something had been missed. The detective provided that showing. The medical examiner's office, which was a two-person operation in a small county and was not set up for complex toxicological analysis, sent the samples to a state laboratory. The state laboratory results took 9 days. Those 9 days were the longest of my life in a specific and particular way. Not because I was in immediate danger. I was 4 hours away, staying with my brother, sleeping on his couch and going through my days in a kind of suspended state where nothing felt quite real, but because I was waiting to find out whether my grandmother had been murdered, whether the woman who had sat across from me at holiday tables and remembered the names of every teacher I'd ever had died because the son she trusted to take care of her had poisoned her so he could have her house. The first results from my own blood work came back in 6 days. There were trace amounts of a compound the lab had flagged as consistent with a rodenticide derivative, something used historically in certain agricultural contexts, but with no legitimate reason to be in the bloodstream of a person eating a normal diet. The levels were low. The lab technician who reviewed the report told the medical examiner's office that at the concentrations found, the compound would not have caused acute harm, but that sustained exposure at those levels over an extended period would have begun to affect cognitive function and could, over time, have contributed to more serious neurological effects. Over time. The phrase I kept coming back to. Over time. I had been in that house for 4 months. I thought about my grandmother being in that house for the last 1.5 years of her life. On the 9th day, the state laboratory results came back on my grandmother's retained samples. The medical examiner called the detective. The detective called my brother. My brother called me and said, "They found it. It was there. It was in her system at levels consistent with sustained administration over at least a year. The compound was the same class as what had been found in my blood. The source was the same. What my uncle had done to my grandmother was not an accident, not a misread prescription, not a tragic misunderstanding. It was deliberate and sustained and calculated, performed by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and how long it would take and what the result would be. He had poisoned his own mother over the course of more than a year. He had kept her confused and diminished and increasingly incapable of meaningful decision-making. He had managed the paperwork while she was in that state, transferred the house into his name, redirected her accounts, positioned himself as her devoted caretaker and sole heir, and then, when there was nothing left to extract, she had died, and he had stood at her graveside and accepted condolences. The detective applied for an arrest warrant on a Friday morning. I know the exact timing because she called me and told me. She said she wanted me to know before it happened. She said the warrant had been approved and that officers would be at the house within the hour. My uncle was in the backyard when they arrived. He was in his garden, which he kept with the same precision he kept the kitchen. Everything in its place, everything tended. A neighbor who was walking their dog watched it happen and described it to a local news outlet later. The squad cars pulling up, the officers going around the side of the house, my uncle looking up from what he was doing with an expression the neighbor described as not surprised, not frightened, annoyed. The way someone looks when they've been interrupted doing something important and don't think the interruption is justified. He was handcuffed in his garden in his work gloves and brought to the county detention facility. The detective called my brother 20 minutes later. My brother called me. I sat in my car in a parking lot and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my mother died. Not for my uncle, for my grandmother, for the version of her last years that I had believed in, the version where she had been tended to and loved and surrounded by family, and what it meant that that version was a lie. She had been afraid and confused and diminishing, and the person in charge of her care had been causing it. She had died in the house where she was born, and the last person in the world who should have been with her had been there. I cried for a long time, and then I wiped my face and drove to my brother's apartment because I didn't know where else to go. The criminal case moved faster than I expected, which the detective told me later was partly due to the strength of the evidence and partly due to the cooperation of several witnesses who had information they'd been carrying without a place to put it. The visiting nurse, who had retired to another state and who had signed nothing and said nothing when my grandmother died because she hadn't known what she knew or what it meant, now knew. She provided a detailed written statement about the fluctuations she had observed in my grandmother's condition, the pattern of better days and worse days, the specific occasions when my grandmother had seemed almost herself, and the occasions when she had seemed barely present. The nurse said she had told herself it was the nature of the decline. She said she had not known there was another explanation. The pharmacist who had filled certain orders, not the prescriptions, the supplements, the items purchased in cash that had been part of my uncle's routine for the better part of 2 years, provided records. The attorney who had notarized the document transferring the house provided a statement about the condition my grandmother had been in when she signed it. Confused, uncertain who was in the room, asking twice what she was signing, and being told by my uncle in the attorney's presence that it was something related to her insurance. The attorney said he had flagged it internally at the time, had asked to speak with my grandmother alone, and had been told by my uncle that she was having a difficult day and got confused when there were too many people present. The attorney said he had let it go. He said he had thought about it many times since. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman who had spent 12 years handling elder abuse cases and financial crimes against vulnerable adults. She had a reputation, my brother told me, for being thorough in a way that made defense attorneys nervous. She reviewed everything the detective had assembled and told the detective that the case was strong enough to proceed on multiple charges and that she intended to pursue all of them. The charges, when they were filed, were elder abuse, elder financial abuse, involuntary manslaughter in the death of my grandmother, insurance fraud related to misrepresented caregiving costs, and criminal poisoning in the case involving me. The poisoning charge against me was the one that surprised me the most when I first heard it stated in legal language. Somehow, even knowing what I knew, hearing it laid out in a formal charge made it more real than it had been. My uncle had poisoned me. That was a crime with a name. That was a thing that had happened and could be proven. The preliminary hearings went for 2 months. I flew back to testify at one of them, a proceeding where the prosecutor needed to establish the timeline of my residency in the house and the circumstances of my leaving. I sat in a courthouse chair and answered questions in a room where my uncle was also sitting, 20 feet away, and I looked at him once and then did not look at him again. He looked like himself. That was the hardest part. He looked exactly like the man who had offered me the spare room and made chili and brought me coffee while I applied for jobs. He looked like someone's uncle. He looked like the person I had spent 4 months believing he was. He sat with his hands folded on the table and watched the proceedings with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not remorse, not anger, something more neutral and more unsettling than either. He did not look at me. The case went to trial 7 months after his arrest. By that point, I had moved out of my brother's apartment into a place of my own, a small rental in a city 2 hours away, where I had finally found work in my field again, a coordinator position at a company that did not know the specific shape of what I had been through and did not need to. I was rebuilding. That's the word I kept using in my head, rebuilding. Like there was a structure I had been standing on that had turned out to be constructed on something rotten, and the structure had collapsed, and I was collecting the pieces that were still good and putting them somewhere new. Therapy helped. I want to say that clearly because I know it sounds like the expected thing to say, but it was true in a specific way for me. Not because the therapist had answers I didn't, she didn't, and she was honest about that, but because there was something in the act of saying the full thing out loud in sequence to another person who was not my brother and who had no emotional stake in any of it that made the full thing more real and therefore more survivable. You can know something intellectually and still be carrying it at a different level. Therapy was the process of moving it from one level to the other, and that took longer than I expected and was harder than I expected and was also the most useful thing I did in the year that followed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecutor presented the toxicological evidence, the financial records, the testimony of the visiting nurse, the notarizing attorney, and the pharmacist. She presented my testimony and my brother's testimony. She presented the results of the state laboratory analysis on my grandmother's retained samples and the analysis of my own blood work. A toxicologist testified for 2 full days about the compounds involved, their effects, their sourcing, and the consistency of the evidence with deliberate sustained administration. The defense attorney argued that the toxicological evidence was inconclusive, that my grandmother's decline was consistent with natural causes, that my blood work results were explainable by environmental exposure rather than deliberate poisoning, and that my uncle was a devoted caretaker being persecuted by a family that had misread his grief. He argued this with a straight face and a professional confidence that I found, sitting in the gallery, nearly unbearable. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they came back with the verdict, I was in the courthouse hallway with my brother. The bailiff came out and said they were ready, and we went in and sat down, and I held my brother's hand in a way we hadn't done since we were children, since our father's funeral, and the jury filed in, and the foreperson stood, and the word guilty came out of her mouth 11 times, once for each count, and I felt my brother's hand tighten on mine with each one. My uncle sat with his hands on the table and showed nothing. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. The prosecutor argued for the maximum on each count, citing the sustained and calculated nature of the crimes, the particular vulnerability of the victim in the elder abuse charges, and the evidence that my uncle had not acted on impulse or desperation, but had engaged in a methodical and extended pattern of behavior. She described what my grandmother's last year had actually been, stripped of the cover story, the confusion manufactured and sustained by someone she trusted, the legal documents signed in that state, the death that had followed. She said, "This was not a crime of passion or of need. This was a crime of design." The judge sentenced my uncle to 22 years on the combined charges. He would be in his late 80s when he was eligible for release, if he survived that long. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and the last thing I saw before he went through the door was the back of his head, the gray hair, and the familiar set of his shoulders, and then the door closed and he was gone. I went outside and stood in the parking lot for a while. It was a cold day, early winter, and there were bare trees along the sidewalk and a wind that made it necessary to pull my coat tighter. My brother stood beside me. We didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying by then. He said, "She would have understood all of this better than we did." I said, "I know. She was sharp until she wasn't." We stood there for a while longer and then got in our separate cars and drove in separate directions. There are things I still think about, not obsessively. I'm not the person I was in the months immediately after, when the thinking ran in loops and found no exit. But there are things that surface. I think about the bowl of chili on the counter, and what would have happened if my brother had called 5 minutes later after I'd finished eating. I think about the 4 months of dinners before that night. I think about the morning routine and the coffee and the crossword puzzle comparisons I made between my grandmother and myself without knowing what they meant. I think about the visiting nurse who had carried her suspicion for more than a year without a place to put it. I think about the notarizing attorney who had asked a question and accepted an insufficient answer and let it go. I think about all the surfaces of the thing that looked exactly like care. I've had my blood tested 3 more times in the 18 months since. The traces cleared after my second test. The third and fourth came back clean across all relevant markers. My neurologist, I have a neurologist now, which is a sentence I did not expect to be saying, reviewed my history and my results and told me that based on the exposure period and the compound levels documented in my initial tests, there was unlikely to be lasting neurological impact. He said he wanted to see me annually for the next 3 years as a precaution. He said, "You're going to be fine." I choose to believe him. I choose to believe it because the alternative is to not believe it, and not believing it doesn't serve anything. The house is under litigation. My uncle's assets, including the house, are subject to recovery proceedings that my brother has been involved with in a legal capacity. My grandmother's estate, to the extent it can be reconstructed, is being sorted out in a process that will probably take another year. I'm not expecting anything from it. That was never the point. There's one more thing I haven't told you. The thing the prosecutor mentioned at sentencing that made the gallery go quiet in a specific way. When investigators had done a full background review on my uncle, the kind of deep review that happens when someone is facing serious criminal charges and the prosecutors want to understand the full picture, they found something that had never been connected to him, had never even raised a flag in a county 2 states away, 11 years earlier. An elderly relative of his late wife, a man who had lived alone and declined rapidly and died, leaving a small estate that had passed to my uncle and his wife through a will signed in the last months of the man's life when those who knew him said he had not been himself. The death had been ruled natural causes. No one had examined it more closely at the time because there had been no reason to. The family had been grieving. My uncle had been helpful with the arrangements. The prosecutor said this at sentencing as context for the sentencing recommendation. She said, "The pattern of behavior in this case did not begin with the victim in this case." The judge listened. He incorporated it into his remarks when he sentenced. He said, "What has been demonstrated here is not a single act of desperation. What has been demonstrated is a pattern of behavior toward vulnerable people who trusted you. That pattern has a cost, and you are going to pay it." I think about that sometimes. The man in the county 2 states away, 11 years ago, who did not have a brother calling from a blocked number at 3 a.m., who did not have someone who noticed that the numbers didn't add up, who did not have someone methodical and careful, who felt physically uncomfortable leaving a discrepancy unexamined. That man had no one like that, and so no one has yet answered for what happened to him. Maybe they will now. The investigation there has been reopened. Maybe they won't. Maybe it was too long ago and the evidence is too degraded and the records are too incomplete. That's the part I don't know yet. That's the part I think about when I lie awake. The food in my apartment, I buy myself. I cook it myself, or I eat out, or I get things delivered. I don't eat food that other people have prepared for me unless I've watched them prepare it, and I know that's something my therapist and I are working on. The degree to which that specific wariness has generalized beyond what's useful. I know it doesn't have to be a permanent way of living. I know that most people who cook you food are just cooking you food. I know that. Most days, knowing it is enough. Most days.